Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love. One of the stories that we've been following here at Securing America, with the help of our first guest particularly, is the horrifying prospect that the Chinese Communist Party, that has brought us the COVID-19 pandemic with murderous effect here and elsewhere around the world, actually has in mind making use of similar and perhaps far more deadly biological warfare against this country, perhaps incredibly, for the purpose of depopulating it and colonizing it. That's a thesis that we're going to hear more about from our guest, Lawrence Sellin. He is a retired United States Army Reserves colonel with combat experience in Afghanistan and in Iraq. He is a man who has also got, to his credit, a PhD, which he used as part of his 29 years, working in the Army's premier biowarfare defense research facility known as USAMRID at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He also is a distinguished entrepreneur and businessman, and these days a very important contributor to our understanding of what we're confronting in the form of biological threats from the Chinese Communist Party at a terrific online platform, Gateway Pundit. Lawrence Sellin, welcome back to Secure Freedom Radio's television counterpart, Securing America. We spoke with you on the radio earlier this week, and we wanted to recap for this audience what we have been learning, thanks in part to the serious deep dives you've been doing into open source literature and other evidence of the extent of this Chinese Communist Party biowarfare program. Sort of level set for us, if you would, sir, on the doctrine that animates this apparently massive program in communist China.
Yes, indeed, Frank. Thank you for having me on your program. The Chinese biowarfare program accelerated enormously in the last 20 years. Prior to the first coronavirus pandemic in 2002 and 2004, the Chinese were mainly focused on some of the traditional biological agents that come from nature, things like, botulinum toxin or the plague or various kinds of viruses. After the first coronavirus pandemic, the Chinese military doctrine started talking about what is essentially biotechnology-driven designer bioweapon. They thought of biowarfare as essentially a replacement for nuclear warfare, because nuclear warfare would destroy not only populations but the infrastructure. So they were looking towards using these weapons to really kill the populations or debilitate the populations by maintaining the infrastructure as a way to move towards taking over a country and
exploiting it, needless to say. And I understand this was a decision made very early on, early 1990s, by Deng Xiaoping, the general secretary at the time of the Communist Party, to actually, as I say, put Chinese into this country, colonize it effectively, take it over, having essentially eliminated, or as you say, very much debilitated and depleted the native population. This sounds incredible, and yet it does have a lot of evidence behind it, not least of which is the reported bioengineering of weapons to target certain ethnic populations or subgroups of those populations. What do we know about all that?
Well, we know it from reading the Chinese military doctrine in the Chinese language, some of which we've translated, and they speak about genetic weapons that affect certain ethnic groups or races, and then creating vaccines that only protect the Han Chinese, for example. So they're deeply involved in this kind of very detailed research that would lead to bioweapons that would target certain populations, certain ethnic groups or races.
And what's fascinating about that, as you say, is that there's a kind of racism behind it, this Han supremacism, it's been called, that they're the superior race, the master race, I guess Hitler would have called it, but he was thinking of somebody else, of course. But they're seeking to assure the dominance of this race of Han Chinese using these kinds of, again, bioengineered weapons. And Colonel Sellin, we've talked about this before, and I just want to visit with you against the backdrop of the most recent of your reports, which we're going to get into in more detail in a moment. But just on this question of, was the pandemic unleashed by evidently the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the so-called COVID-19 virus, I call it the Chinese Communist Party virus, at a minimum, a proof of concept of how biological warfare would work if the Chinese unleashed it, if it weren't actually an example of such biological warfare? Your thoughts?
Well, it's crystal clear to me that the COVID-19 virus came from a laboratory, because certain elements within the virus itself could not have evolved from nature. And it's also clear that COVID-19 virus was part of China's biological warfare program. And the technology was designed, as I said, such that it could, affect certain populations or debilitate a society. And there's evidence on both sides, whether it may have been accidentally released or intentional release. If you look at what happened in 2019, when the virus was at least nearly fully developed and was given to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for testing, both for transmission, and there is evidence to say that PLA wanted to test it in a population.
Hold that thought, Lawrence Sellin. We're going to be right back with more on both the magnitude of the existential threat that this disease and the biological warfare program that spawned it represents to our country. We're going to make sure that we also talk about the incredible story of the extent to which we have helped this biological warfare program metastasize against us. Much more with Lawrence Sellin right after this. Welcome back. We are talking with Colonel Dr. Lawrence Sellin, a man of considerable both professional credentials and accomplishments, as well as service to our country in uniform of the United States Army. And Colonel, we've just been celebrating Veterans Day. I want to salute you among many others who have served their country with great distinction and sacrificed so that we have a chance to continue to be the home of the free and the land of the brave. I wanted to start, though, this particular block by building upon what we were just talking about in terms of the extent to which we're up against now a truly mortal peril from the Chinese Communist Party in the form, yes, of nuclear threats and perhaps other exotic weapon systems like hypersonics and a whole host of conventional ones. But this biological warfare business is particularly chilling because of its demonstrated capacity, look no further than the COVID-19 pandemic, to cause mass devastation in our country, and probably a lot worse than what we've seen to date if they are continuing to hone these capabilities against us in particular. So Lawrence, let me just ask you about the most incredible piece of this story of all, as far as I'm concerned, which is the extent to which the United States of America has in fact been helping those in China. And it turns out, your research has indicated that basically everybody, whether in the pharmaceutical industry or they're in research institutions or academia or private sector companies of other kinds, everybody's pulling together in China behind this biological warfare program. So basically, anybody that's working in any of those fields with us is part of the problem. Talk to us about the extent to which that reality has translated into an immense enhancement of the threat we now face from biological warfare at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, China's biological warfare program is at 3 levels. The first level is a secret military level composed of its military research centers and military hospitals. Now, layered on top of that are all of China's universities, quote, civilian research centers, and their pharmaceutical companies. In China, there's no difference between military and civilian research. And this was mandated at the 13th Communist Party 5-year plan in 2016, where they say you have to fuse military and civilian. So they use this level to access international laboratories, particularly in the United States. And for the last 30 years, they've been sending Chinese scientists, many of which are from People's Liberation Army, to the United States. They work in the United States. They access knowledge, skills, and technology and bring them back to China, which feeds into their the People's Liberation Army biowarfare program.
Give us some examples, if you would, of that kind of penetration. I mean, we've been hearing a lot, albeit with a lot of obfuscation and downright lies, including sworn testimony to the United States Congress by Anthony Fauci, about the magnitude of the help we've been giving to the Chinese laboratories like the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. That's bad enough. It's many millions of dollars over many years, to say, I guess, a conservative estimate. But talk to us about the extent to which this has also actually been done here in this United States infrastructure. And give us some examples of the people who've been doing it and their credentials.
Well, Frank, there's been massive infiltration by China into U.S. research programs, in particular the virus research programs. I can just give you one example. There was a Chinese scientist who came to the United States. His name is Shi-Ang Gao. He came to the United States in around 1990, when the Clinton administration took over, soon after that. And he studied here, obtaining a PhD at Thomas Jefferson University, did 6 years of postdoc, in particular at the Jackson Laboratory in Maine, which breeds mice, genetically engineered mice for special purposes in medical research, particularly virus research. And he took that technology back to China and became the head of a Jackson Laboratory type facility at Nanjing University. And this played
when you say
directly
type, you
into,
mean they've essentially replicated what they stole in the way of technology from the U.S., is that right?
Precisely. He built the Jackson Laboratory at Nanjing University. And what's critical about this is these types of genetically engineered mice are used in the laboratory for the creation of COVID-19. So it contributed directly to People's Liberation Army biowarfare program. Not only that, he established a company based on the Jackson Laboratory in China, and this Chinese company has recently opened a facility in the United States that in California and Massachusetts they'll breed these types of mice for research. So essentially, the technology that they took from Jackson Laboratory, they've recreated in China and is selling the same type of mice in the United States. And his company was funded by the Chinese Communist Party, but also funded by Morgan Stanley and two
Goldman
others,
Sachs.
Sequoia Capital Research and another U.S.-based capital funding company. So we're essentially, paying the Chinese to beat us. So,
to kill us, I think is to put a fine point on it. if that's
they're
the
not
practical effect of these mice, is going to be enhancing their ability to do that biological warfare business. One other thing, which is sort of an aside, Lawrence, and maybe something you're not focused on at the moment, but I think we all ought to be thinking about, is bioengineering of mice is presumably someplace on the learning curve if you're also interested in bioengineering humans. Is it not? Does this feed into efforts that we are told the Chinese are also doing to develop superhumans or super warriors, these technologies?
Oh, definitely. This is in the Chinese military doctrine as well. Mm-hmm. And what they're doing is they have a database of human DNA. They're collecting huge amounts of information, not only within China, but outside China. Some of the test kits, medical test kits that China is offering to the world, they're able to access the DNA from, the United States or Europe, and they're putting that DNA information into their own database.
Right. For presumably the purposes of weaponizing it, among other things. I'm told they also intend to dominate the health industry, and that data would be very helpful in that regard as well, worldwide. Going back to what you said a moment ago, all part of the practice of unrestricted warfare against our economy that has resulted in hollowing out so much of it. The so-called Rust Belt has been, a prime example of the victims that have been left behind as a result of these Chinese predatory trade and investment practices. But let me ask you about this. In your research, much of which has been published in recent months at Gateway Pundit, Lawrence Sellin, there are a number of individuals like this fellow that you mentioned with actual expertise in these bio-warfare programs in China and or direct ties to the People's Liberation Army. I think you have one photograph of a female doctor actually wearing the uniform of the United States Army, for heaven's sakes, when she was working in one of our Army chemical research facilities, as I understand it. I mean, this is just staggering, the extent to which we have been aiding and abetting the enemy in arguably its most dangerous weapons programs. And I just would ask you, is it possible that this has not been stopped by now? At least over there, we've been hearing a lot about how it's intolerable, but how about the work that these folks are doing here? Is there any effort to roll that up and cease it?
I don't see any evidence that anyone is taking any steps to stop what is happening. There are Chinese scientists who have come to the United States. Some of them are citizens of the United States, but they're continuing to work directly with Chinese scientists in the mainland, and some of them are working directly with the People's Liberation Army and those within China's biowarfare program. So I see no evidence that there's any intent or active measures taken to stop what is going on.
The cumulative effect of which, just bottom line, is what? We have helped enormously enhance the threat we're facing to our people in this country, possibly inviting and facilitating their mass destruction?
Well, I would say that there's a Chinese Communist Party cadre in the United States. As I said, there's massive infiltration of the research area by the Chinese. They're not only working directly with the scientists in China and in the PLA, but they're working with each other in the United States and feeding back the information into China. So
and creating a vastly bigger problem for the rest of us. Lawrence, we have to leave it at that. We're going to talk in a moment with Charles Faddis, former intelligence officer and specialist in bioterrorism, about how this could possibly be taking place and continuing. But I want to say thank you, Lawrence, to you for this terrific research and for bringing it to our attention. We'll look forward to further updates from you as that research continues. I also want to say to the rest of you, stay tuned for more about what this might mean for you and the people that you love. With Sam Faddis right after this.